Curious about Victorian literature but not sure where to start? My name's Jack, this is Spread Book Joy, and today I'm going to do what we call a tag video. A tag video is where we answer a series of questions around a topic, a bookish themed topic, and this beautiful tag was created by the lovely Ros over at Scally About the Books and Tilly at Tilly's Shelf, and they created it last October in honour of Victober, the month-long readathon devoted to reading Victorian literature here on BookTube, and I think it's one of the longest running readathons on BookTube, and it's very, very popular, and for me it's a delightful time of year. I don't usually read tons of Victorian literature during Victober. I like to read other things as well, but I always read at least one Victorian book during October because of this readathon. I listened to a book this Victober, and I want to talk to you about my favourite audiobook app for classics, which is Audrey, and they kindly gifted me a book this year, but I have been buying books from Audrey for some time, and in fact I did a video recommending Audrey, two videos which recommend Audrey, but one was specifically about Audrey a few years ago when I discovered them, because it's just one of the most original and thoughtful and beautifully designed audiobook apps I have ever seen, and I think it's pretty unique in what it does. So I'll get into that in a bit, because I think if you're struggling to get into classics or Victorian literature, I think it's a great way in, but I'll talk about that later. Let's get into the tag. So question number one, what was your first experience reading Victorian literature and how was it? So I thought about my first experience reading what I knew to be Victorian literature, and that was Dracula. And I read Dracula. It wasn't this version of it, but it was a version lent to me by my English teacher in secondary school when I was about 14, I think, and I loved it, and I read it really, really quickly. So yeah, that was what I thought was my first experience of Victorian literature. However, also it kind of probably tipped me off on a lifelong love of vampire stories, and I read a lot of Anne Rice when I was younger, because it was pre-Twilight, pre all of that. I was that sort of thing wasn't around then, but there was then in my sort of late teens, early 20s, got hugely into Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I did try a little bit of, oh gosh, what's her name? Oh, I did the Urban Vampire series, but anyway, I got into Sookie Stackhouse and the True Blood books and all of that kind of thing when I was younger. So yeah, I had a real love of vampire fiction after reading Dracula. So yes, it was a big influence on me. But then I thought about it, and actually I thought, you know, I've probably read some Victorian books when I was young, but I didn't think of them as Victorian literature. So I went through my box of existing children's books from when I was young, and I found, of course, one of my favourite books when I was young, and that is Black Beauty by Anna Sewell. This was a favourite book of mine. One of my aunties bought it for me, Christmas 1985, I think, and yeah, I loved this book. I read it cover to cover, and I read it several times, more than several times. I read it loads, and I didn't turn into one of those girls who loves horses. I did draw a lot of horses after reading Black Beauty, but I wasn't one of those girls who got obsessed with horses and books about horses, because I was, you know, a young working class girl who grew up on a council estate who never saw a real horse in her life. But I watched Black Beauty on the TV, and it was on a lot in the 80s. And I don't know if the 80s, it was a rerun from the 70s, because a lot of our TV, I think, was reruns from the 70s then, because sometimes I talk to people who are like 10, 15 years older than me, and they're like, how do you know all this 70s TV? Like, because that's all they did in the 80s was show reruns of 70s stuff. But Black Beauty was on over here in the UK. It was serialised, and if you know, you know. But I have the theme tune stuck in my head whenever I think of this book. But yes, Black Beauty is a wonderful story. It's told from the perspective of the horse Black Beauty, who is sold to several different masters, and basically it's a pro-animal rights, an early kind of pro-animal rights book. So I think I'd like to reread it to see if it still stands up to my memories of it. But yeah, I think it probably gave me my love of animal protagonists. So all of these Victorian literature books that I'm mentioning so far, my early ones, my formative books that I loved, I think they have influenced my reading, because I, to this day, absolutely adore an animal protagonist. And this is the first kind of I suppose you would call it a novel that I read that had an animal protagonist narrating the story, and not an animal like a magical animal, but an animal, a real animal telling their story and their life story. So yeah, absolutely loved Black Beauty. I also found this. Does anyone remember these like stories for 8-year-olds, stories for 7-year-olds? I found this copy, which is from my childhood, and there is a Charles Dickens short story in here, and I definitely read that. I read all of these. I mean, absolutely everything that's in my box of books from when I was young, I read cover to cover several times, and this has The Magic Fishbone by Charles Dickens in here. So yeah, that a bit more Victorian literature from my childhood. Number 2, has the reading of a Victorian book ever brought you to tears? Initially I was going to say no, a straight out no, but that's not true, because I remember a few Victobers ago, reading Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell, and it did move me to tears. I don't want to go into spoilers because that's something I'm going to talk about a bit later when I talk about reading Victorian literature. So I'm not going to tell you the bit that brought me to tears, but there is loss in this book. Let's just put it that way. There is a lot of loss in Victorian novels. You know, there's a lot of death in Victorian England. So yeah, but I remember being moved to tears by characters in this book. So yeah, Cranford, if you're not aware, is serialization. Basically, it's not a novel, it's a series of vignettes that were serialized in Charles Dickens magazine, written by Elizabeth Gaskell, and I read this for the first time a couple of years ago. It was my first Gaskell, and absolutely loved it. I loved it. Lots of people don't like it because it's not a straightforward novel with a complete running story, like a central plot, if you like. It's just a series of vignettes about life in this fictional rural village in the north of England. Very funny, it's very humorous, and oh yeah, I just loved it. I really enjoyed Cranford, and it did make me cry. It did bring me to tears. 3, are there any people who have played a significant role in your Victorian literature journey? Not really. I suppose my mum used to buy me books. She did buy me, actually, talking about things that I read when I was younger, she did buy me lots of those old sort of abridged versions of Dickens when I was very young, and they were like done almost in like in a flat picture book format, and they were illustrated Charles Dickens books, and I wish I still had those, but they were I think Oliver Twist and Great Expectations was in there, so yeah, but I don't really think about it in terms of Victorian literature. I suppose the teacher who gave me Dracula, I can thank that person. Also the teacher at A-level who chose Wuthering Heights for A-level, because I remember we had Wuthering Heights, and I did also studied Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and I hated Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but I loved Wuthering Heights, so this kind of redeemed Victorian literature for me at that time. Yeah, I've got a really soft spot for this book. I know it's a very much a Marmite book, you either love it or hate it, but it still, the images that came through in this book when I was reading it, and the writing and the suspense and the sort of gothic nature of the book really gripped me, and I really like Wuthering Heights. So yeah, so I suppose I have a lot of my teachers to thank for it, really. But my mum would always buy, if she saw things out and about that might be of interest and were stories that she knew. My mum wasn't what I'd call a huge Victorian literature reader, but she watched loads of adaptations, the old black and white adaptations of these films when she was younger, and she loves them. So yeah, films of these books, I should say. And she loves a period drama. So yeah, she would, if she saw things out and about and she thought I'd like it, she would get it for me. Number 4, do you have a favourite film or TV adaptation of a Victorian book? Yes, Muppet Christmas Carol. Need I say more? What about one you'd like to see made? I'd definitely like to see a new version of Wuthering Heights. And apparently I'm getting my wish, because I've just heard there's a rumour that there will be a new Wuthering Heights. I don't know if it would be a film or a TV adaptation, but yes, I think we are ready for it. I'd like to see that. Possibly with what's his name from Poldark in the lead. I think he'd be a great Heathcliff. Which character in Victorian literature most resembles you, or do you identify with most? I don't think I resemble any Victorian characters. However, I really identified with Agnes Grey. Anne Bronte's novel Agnes Grey is about a young woman and it being a governess, and she encounters some difficult parents and difficult children, as well as I can't remember now if she encounters some really nice families and children, or if it's just all pretty dire. But when she was trying to deal with some very difficult situations when she's trying to teach, I could identify with that quite well. So yeah, Agnes Grey in terms of identifying with what she had to deal with. But I don't know personality wise I'm like her, but yeah. her situation. Number 6, do you have a favourite moment, scene or line from Victorian literature? I suppose this is quite boring, but I'm going to have to go with, and I don't want to do spoilers for books, but I think it's really famous, but the scene in Wuthering Heights where Cathy is knocking at the window, because I remember reading that and just being absolutely thrilled by it, by the sort of gothic supernatural nature of it. I loved it, and still to this day I think it's a great scene. That one, in terms of lines, none that stick out from the top of, oh, actually that's not true. Lines from A Christmas Carol. I've not read a ton of Dickens, but I've read A Christmas Carol so many times and I've taught it, and I absolutely love the opening line to A Christmas Carol because I've talked about it and pulled it apart and debated it with children so many times, and absolutely love it. So that is, Marley was dead to begin with, which I think is a great opening line for any book. Straight away you get the character, you get the problem and premise here. There's a hook, there's a question in there. What do you mean he was dead to begin with? Who is dead to begin with? Like, you finish up dead, you don't start out dead. Straight away you know it's going to be supernatural. There's a character called Marley and you've got questions like arising from it, but it's not the most original of lines to pick, but I love it. Does any Victorian literature intimidate you? If so, what and why? I don't think Victorian literature intimidates me as such. I do want to read like bigger books like Middlemarch or some of the bigger Dickens books like Bleak House, but I'm a little bit wary of how much brain power that's going to take up and how long it would take me, because I might have to do it in small doses just to make sure I'm getting the full meaning out of the book. What tips would you give someone early on in their Victorian literature journey? I've got a few. First of all, my first tip is, don't think of it as Victorian literature, just think of them as books. So they are books, they're novels, they're meant to be enjoyed, and they're meant to be enjoyed as such, like any other book. So just think of them as that. Don't think of them as this kind of like lofty thing that you have to aspire to or learn how to read. They are just novels, they were written to entertain, and yeah, just think of them like that. Secondly, don't read blurbs. Don't read the blurbs. If you want some idea of what a book is about, I'd watch someone like Katie or Marissa or Kate Howe or Ros, the hosts of Victober. I would watch them and get their opinions on like books to read, because they'll summarise them without spoiling them, whereas quite a lot of Victorian literature, for some reason publishers seem to think that everyone knows the story. So on Cranford, there is a huge spoiler at the back of Cranford where they tell you about what happens to all the characters, so don't read that, especially at the back of this Penguin Classics version. And yeah, I'd say stay away from introductions, stay away from blurbs, because you're liable to have the story spoiled, because it's as if they don't think people are reading them just for the pleasure of reading them. And I don't know about you, but I don't want spoilers with my fiction. Then the other thing I would say is that you should, if you've never read any Victorian literature, but you know the kind of books you like, maybe pick up a book that's in that genre. So if you like crime, maybe pick up some Wilkie Collins or Arthur Conan Doyle. Also pick up some adventure stories like King Solomon's Mines by H. Rider Haggard. Go for a genre that you know you already like. Maybe try a Victorian children's book like Black Beauty. The last tip I'm going to give you, and it's not a very new tip, but it is just wonderful to listen to the books being read. Sometimes you can pick up a Victorian novel and when you read it, it sounds quite stilted and the language is quite formal, and you're reading it, it doesn't sound natural, it doesn't sound like it's going to be enjoyable to read. So if you get a really great narrator reading the book, nothing quite like it. It completely brings it to life. And sometimes I like to read and listen at the same time, so it kind of just, the words just leap off the page at you doing that. And I'm going to recommend and talk to you about my recent reading experiences with the Audrey app. So Audrey kindly gifted me a copy of Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet, which is the first Sherlock Holmes novel, and I listened to this for Victober in honour of my lovely dear friend Alice. There were some prompts for listening to books related to books that Alice loved, and another booktuber that we lost sadly, who passed away this year, Jennifer Brooks, and she loved Wilkie Collins. So one of the challenges was to listen to one of those authors' books in honour of those two wonderful booktubers. And so Audrey, a friend who actually now works for Audrey, reached out and said, oh hey, in honour of Alice, I know a lot of you might be reading Arthur Conan Doyle, do you want to have a code for a free Arthur Conan Doyle book? And seeing as I love Audrey anyway, I said yes. So even if they hadn't reached out to me, I would have bought the book on Audrey. Audrey's a great app. It's an audiobook app, independently run here in the UK, but you can basically get Audrey worldwide. And they have their own classics collection. I think they have some modern novels on there too, but mostly classics. And the app is just, first of all, beautifully designed. Secondly, the narration is absolutely top class. The Sherlock Holmes narration was fantastic, and I can't wait to listen to more Sherlock Holmes on Audrey. I'm definitely going to be downloading more. They've got a few of the Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock books on there. So you have this amazing narration, beautiful app to work within. But that is not all. What's really amazing about Audrey is, and my friend Charlie over at Charlie Book Reads, she put it really well, and she's like, it's like having a friend in your pocket telling you all about this book that you're reading. So if you're really new to Victorian literature and classics, you could do a lot worse than downloading something that's got a guide to tell you about the book as you go. And what's brilliant about the guide is it's written by an expert. They've selected these experts to curate these guides, and as you read, each chapter then has an accompanying guide that pops up once you've finished the chapter. So there are no spoilers, and the guide can contain stuff about the story, the plot, the characters, the context. There will be links to articles and videos that you can follow if you want to actually expand your knowledge a bit more. There are links to Spotify playlists to listen to while you're reading the book that the guide has curated. It's just a marvellous, very, very unique reading experience. And actually, at the cost of it, most of their audiobooks are only about $3.99, which is about half the price of the majority of audiobook apps out there in terms of what they charge for the audiobook. So that is my biggest tip for you. And I was gifted this copy of Sherlock Holmes in exchange for my honest opinion and review of it, and I loved it. The book itself, let's talk about the book itself. A Study in Scarlet. It's the first Sherlock Holmes book, and the bits, there are sort of, I suppose you can split it into three parts. There's the initial part with the crime, when we meet Sherlock Holmes with Dr. Watson for the first time. Then there's sort of they're solving the crime. So this is the first part, and they're getting all the clues. Then we flash back to the sort of motives behind the crime. I didn't quite care for that bit. And I don't want to give spoilers, but I didn't quite care for that bit as much as I did the bits that were set in London with Holmes and Watson. And then we come back to Holmes and Watson for the end of it. But yeah, what an amazing way to read it. And I'd never read A Study in Scarlet all the way through. So yeah, thank you, Audrey, for that copy of the book. And please go out and get it. I'm going to put a link in the description box to the Audrey newsletter that you can sign up to, because they run readathons regularly. And yeah, I just love that app. If you like classics, if you're not sure about classics and want to try them, give Audrey a go. You won't regret it. Finally, I've got to recommend some books for people who read Victorian literature. And to be honest with you, yes, I have read Victorian literature, but I am not someone I would say is very widely read in Victorian literature. I still need to read, there's so many authors I still want to read. But if you're fairly new to Victorian literature, I can recommend some books to you. And they're books that I recently read in the last few years, and due to Victober actually. One of them is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. And Gaskell, I think, is one of my favourite Victorian authors. She is very accessible. Her writing is really, if you want to pick up something you think you can get into and actually understand and that is accessible, I'd read Gaskell. And this is a story about Margaret Hale, who is a young woman who is kind of forced to move from the south of England to the north of England, and she's quite prejudiced, and we have this kind of dramatic love story emerging between her and well, I'll let you read it. But basically she moves from the south to the north and she has to overcome a lot of prejudices about the industrial north. And what I like about this book particularly is its examination of sort of class and the class system and social justice and things like that, which if you're into those kinds of things, definitely pick up some Gaskell. So this is a really great book. The other book I'd recommend, and I don't have a copy of it here, but I listened to it on Audrey, I believe, was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. And if you're going to pick up a Bronte, like I said, pick up Anne Bronte rather than maybe one of the more famous Bronte sisters. Charlotte and Emily get a lot of the love, but I would pick up Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne. It is a real page turner, and when I talked about sensation novels earlier, this is a real sensation novel. A young woman turns up in a rural village area and she's alone with her son. She's a widow. She basically turns up into this village and she doesn't go to church and she doesn't really want to tell the neighbours about herself. And in living in a small rural area, as I have been recently, that's kind of a no-no. You do have to mix and get along with the community, and even more so in Victorian times. And she wants to keep herself to herself, but that makes people even more suspicious of her. So they're all trying to find out who she is, why she's there, what's going on with her, why she's so reluctant to join in the community. And so it's kind of it's a sensation novel in the true sense of the word. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did and you feel like sticking around, maybe subscribe. If you have a favourite Victorian novel that you'd like to talk about in the comments, please put it down there for me. If it's one I haven't read, I'd like to check it out. No spoilers though, of course. And if you don't know what to say, maybe leave me an emoji of a vampire for Dracula, my first proper Victorian novel, or a horse for Black Beauty. And hopefully I will see you again here soon. Bye.